Hello, and welcome to Automating GDPR Requests for Dynamics. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how the Privacy Central privacy platform actually will connect to an instance of Dynamics and actually executes a data subject GDPR privacy request. I'm Chris Givens, the CEO of Privacy Central, and this is going to be a pretty amazing demo if you use Dynamics and have an issue handling data that's inside Dynamics. So over here we have our Salience Dynamics. Salience is the first instance of where GDPR privacy platform is running. Very successful implementation here. And we see that Chris at Salience.net is inside as a contact inside of Dynamics. Over here I've actually logged into the Privacy Central portal and I've signed in as Chris at Salience.net. I am going to be able to go and search this particular tenant and be able to see the applications that they've created. So as we see here, they have quite a few, a conference platform, Office 365, some Yammer, an on-premises SharePoint environment, a drip instance, and an Active Directory. In this case, we want to send a request off to Dynamics 365. So we'll go ahead and select that. We're going to see that this particular app stub implements query, update, delete. It also would likely implement other things such as consent, except that in the back end, these particular things have been disabled either at the application level, the tenant level, or even at the instance level. So what we want to do is just go ahead and send a request. And so by clicking on this, it's going to allow us to select from our data. This application is set up to allow unverified data, which isn't the greatest idea. We would want to make sure that we review any unverified information that might come in. And so there are use cases for this. However, we're not going to go down that particular path. We're going to go ahead and select the Chris at Salience.net, and we'll say I'm not a robot. Send this query off. The query itself is going to go to the platform. This Dynamics instance is actually not a Dynamics running on premises, although that could be a supported scenario. This is actually Dynamics as in the cloud hosted version. It's going to make calls through supported APIs that are public, and that API is going to execute these requests to find any information that is related to Chris at Salience.net. And what we're going to see here is pretty fast. What ends up happening, it fired it off to a queue, Event Hub, which then fired off functions, which then knew how to get to Dynamics 365, which I will show you the configuration for. And so what we now have is a completed request, which we will then be able to go over here to our exports and see that we can download the information or we can even view it. So one of the things that you can look at, different applications will support different export methods. Some of them support the ability to export records. Others will simply export a URL to a pointer to a set of records, such as Office 365. In the case of Dynamics, we can actually export records, and so by seeing that this was JSON that was returned back, we can go and view the export that came back for Dynamics. So as the end user, we can go and we can navigate the actual JSON. In this case, we got one record back, and we can see that it is the contact that is sitting over here in this particular Dynamics instance here, contact, that we got a contact type back. Can we delete it? Yes. If I had sent some other email aliases, what we would end up seeing is there are certain relationships that exist inside of Dynamics that would say that I would not be allowed to delete this particular record. Some of the instances and cases of that would be if a contact is actually assigned to a contract, then we would look at the policy on the contracts to be able to say we can't delete a contact or an account that's tied to an active contract that doesn't expire for another 2 years, and then maybe another 7 years after that. In which case, if that was the case and it said we cannot delete, says false, you would see a message that says why we would not be able to do that. In this case, we could delete this if we wanted to send a deletion request to Dynamics. That could be done In the meantime, we could go through here and we could look at various different information that's sitting in that came back from Dynamics when we did the query. So each of the records would be in JSON format. That tends to be the easiest to deal with. The platform itself allows for this function language that could say that I want to prune certain things, mask certain things, very flexible from that respect. In terms of this, if I wanted to send a delete, I could. Maybe there was more than one record, and I said as a data subject that rather than delete my entire set of information, I really only want to submit a couple of things that I don't want an organization to have, in which case I would see all of those items, select from them, and say delete those items, which would then send it off to the platform. The request would execute, and those things would be gone. Now, in the case of the back end, if we were to look at what does it look like when we go to configure a Dynamics application, we would come in as the tenant, logged into our particular tenant. A central privacy server can have multiple tenants. So in this case, we're able to see that here's the Dynamics tenant. Selecting it, we can see the different settings that one would configure to enable the connection between the SaaS platform and their Dynamics instance, their tenant. So in this case, we'll see that here's where the setting says allow unverified data. Normally we would say we don't want that to occur. Any information about what is the tenant domain, where it needs to point to in order to authentication. We would have client ID and client secret. That's typically all you would need in order to make the calls over to Dynamics to make the GDPR requests. You could fall back to a username password kind of authentication, and that would work as well. We would pull the bearer token off based on username password. If you're not savvy enough, but each of these actually have documents over in the Privacy Central repo to kind of help you with these properties and how to configure them. Some of them are still a work in progress, but it's getting there. And what you're going to see is, how do I configure the client ID and secret, and what kind of permissions would I need to give that particular application over in Azure AD and over in the Graph API to be able to make true GDPR requests. If you're not savvy enough to do that, then what's going to end up happening is you could set what's called OAuth fallback, where that will fall back to the platform's specific client ID and secret that does have the appropriate permissions set up on it, and then you would just simply need to admin authorize that such that it can make the calls into there to execute whatever it needs to do to get the graph data back. Now, that being said, there are some interesting things that you have to consider when working with any CRM, whether that's Dynamics, Salesforce, LionDesk, anything that might utilize phone numbers. Phone numbers has a very specific problem to them. There is a standard, but unfortunately Dynamics and Salesforce and a few others, most of them do not support that standard. When you do a phone number search and you allow phone numbers to actually go through, if we were to say yes here, then you're going to have to actually execute about 40 some odd permutations of a phone number to figure out if that phone number exists in a CRM tenant, and then aggregate all of those records to return the proper data back. So it's an interesting problem, and one of the ways we solve that is the ability to do phone number normalization. So we would run through your entire Dynamics and normalize every phone number such that we only have to do one query across the entire environment. So that's kind of it. Users would, as a tenant admin, you'd come in here and you'd say just add a new, and you would be presented with all these options which you would need to fill in to point off to your Dynamics, which would then allow for GDPR automated requests.